Hello everyone, welcome to week 11 of our unit, and this week we are looking at the language and cultural diversity of our students and our teachers as well in schools and classrooms, so from a social justice perspective. You'll remember that last week we were focused on the inclusivity of LGBTIQA plus people in our schools and our classrooms, and as I said, this week we're going to be looking at that language and cultural diversity in schools and classrooms. So there's actually going to be two parts to the lecture this week, and we're lucky enough to have a guest speaker in our second part who is an expert on linguistic diversity. She's going to talk about the context of Australian education and our linguistically diverse learners, but a lot of what she says does apply to international contexts as well, and you can think about the context that you've worked in or that you would like to consider this within as well. But I'm going to start us off by looking at an overview of cultural and linguistic diversity, CALD, and what that means for our schools and classrooms when we're catering for students from a variety of different cultures and language backgrounds. So I'll start by defining CALD, and I'll give some examples of what it is, why it's relevant, particularly in our Australian context here. We'll look at the specific learning needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students here in Australia who are CALD learners. And I'm going to focus on Harris's theory this week from two-way learning and how it applies to CALD learners, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, which is what he was writing about. So what is CALD? CALD stands for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse. Culture and language have such huge overlap that we don't have an and or here, because if you're culturally diverse, you probably have linguistic diversity as well, and vice versa. So, I mean, we can think of people as being culturally and linguistically diverse together. Because of the intricate connection between language and culture, which I find fascinating. CALD students have specific learning needs and diverse backgrounds, so we've got to cater for those in a way that actually nourishes their cultures and makes them feel safe in their cultural identities at schools. So we can look at some particular CALD students. Here in Australia, we have EAL/D, which stands for English as an Additional Language or Dialect. You may hear that phrase used, and you may be an English as an additional dialect or language user yourself. We also have students from refugee backgrounds here in Perth and in Australia, and you may have that in the countries that you are familiar with as well. Other countries. We also have, most importantly, I think in the Australian context, to considering our history, we've got to look at the unique Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures that we have, and we have a big obligation to understand and to cater for their diverse learning needs. So I'm going to focus on that in the lecture today. We also have other First Nation cultures who are living here in Australia. We have people from migrant cultures and migrant backgrounds that have moved here. We have bilingual, multilingual, or plurilingual ability students. And these sort of categories apply to other countries as well around the world where you will have these. And you'll probably have other ways that students can be culturally and linguistically diverse in your classrooms too. One that I don't have there, actually, I've just thought of, is we can actually have linguistic diversity based on socioeconomic background as well. And that's something that our guest speaker will touch on a little bit more in her lecture. I'm actually going to focus on cultural diversity in this lecture, although, as I said, the two are intricately overlapped because the second part of the lecture will be more on linguistic diversity. But I'll ask you to start by reflecting on this question. Do you identify yourself as someone with cultural and linguistic diversity? And if so, what does it mean for you to be a CALD student? So take those questions, pause the lecture for a moment, and write a few notes about that in your notes. And I'd really like you to revisit those questions at the end of the two parts of the lectures and to have a think about them again and see if your understanding or perspective has grown or changed after you're learning through these lectures. So pause and do that now. So as I've said a few times, my first point here is that language and culture are intricately related, and linguistic diversity means can mean having English as a second language or dialect as well, or the ability to speak more than one language and that ability too. So the formal language that we have here in Australia, which you'll hear more about in the second part, is Standard Australian English, and we refer to other languages or languages other than English as LOTE in our high school curriculum. So if you are learning, say, French or sign language at school, Auslan, we call that languages other than English, LOTE. And Indigenous people in Australia can and often do have ESLD as well, because they speak English as a second or additional language or dialect. Cultural diversity, as I said, is what I'm going to focus on in this part one of the lecture. And what we mean by cultural diversity means ancestry from various countries around the world and various cultures around the world. So here in Australia, people claim a really broad range of cultural diversity. We have ancestry from more than 190 different countries and 300 different nationalities here in Australia. Within Australia, before colonizers came and started to call it Australia, or this place we call Australia today, is actually a composite of all of these different Indigenous nations. So it really is a very, very diverse country, and you can explore more about that and that map in this week's readings as well. But this is just a place that we call Australia, and within it, it really is a complete land of diversity with many, many different Indigenous nations or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations that were here before it became even imagined to be a singular country or a singular place that we could call ourselves Australian. So sometimes I've heard this phrase that, this place we call Australia, because we've only been calling it Australia for a relatively short time, since the last few centuries. But really, what we have here is a land of diversity, and there are almost 1 million Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are currently living here in Australia. So of those people, about 91% of them identify as Aboriginal people, and about 5% as Torres Strait Islander peoples. And then there's 4% who identify as both within our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. In that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, there's a thriving youth culture. 40% of those people are young people, so it is a growing section of the population. And this is all related to the history of our nation as having those diverse and unique Aboriginal nations within it and lands. When colonization, or if you want to call it invasion, followed, Europeans came along, and we now have migrants here from all over the world. So 26% of Australians in total were born overseas. I think, here in the city of Perth, we're even more diverse, where we've got, if you look at the actual city, 54% of people in Perth are first generations from overseas. And if we look at the greater Perth area, 36%. And the second part of the lecture will talk a bit more about that as well in terms of linguistic diversity in Australia. So as I said, if we look at the city of Perth, you can see that we have a lot of people coming. This is from 2021 Australian Bureau of Statistics data. A lot of people coming from Asian countries now. So places like China, India, Malaysia are topping our list, but we still do have a lot of migration from the United Kingdom, and particularly in the outside the greater Perth area. You can see that there's a huge percentage of the population coming from the United Kingdom. Certainly true up in the Joondalup area where I'm recording the lecture from today. If we look at Perth land from the Aboriginal traditional perspective, we are on Whadjuk Noongar land, and you can see here that the Whadjuk land where it borders with the other traditional lands that are close by. So in the Perth region, the Indigenous people actually called Perth Bula, Brulu, and I'm actually recording this lecture up in Joondalup, where that's a little bit closer to the traditional name with language, which Joondalup, it was actually called that by the Indigenous people who lived here, or still is. And what Joondalup means is place of whiteness or glistening, and place of the long white hair, which is a reference to the beautiful Lake Joondalup, which I love to walk around and enjoy. A very important place for the Whadjuk Noongar people. So you can see, and even within that Whadjuk people, there is diversity as well. So teachers here in Australia can educate themselves about these things and a lot of different aspects of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. There is a cultural responsiveness curriculum that we can engage with online, and we actually have a responsibility as educators to be at least stage 4. If you're going to be teaching in Australia, your initial teacher education program will ensure that you're at stage 4, that you've shown competency in your cultural responsiveness. But that doesn't mean you can stop growing there. And as you can see from this curriculum, you can go all the way through to stages 5 and 6. And there's always continuing work to do at those stages. So there is an online tool, if you're an educator here in Australia, that you can use to assess what stage you think you're at. And how you can build that cultural responsiveness for your culturally and linguistically diverse students in your class that come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. And the beautiful design that you see there, it was created by Indigenous Studios, Igius, I hope I'm saying that right. And it shows that continued flow of knowledge in the spiral, which is a really interesting part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander views about knowledge as well, and how knowledge is shared. So that comes from AITSL, and I encourage you to pursue that reference to do some self-evaluation if you are or aspire to be a teacher here in Australia. So we also have some law and policy about culturally and linguistically diverse students, and particularly about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and our responsibilities to their cultures in our schools and their language. A lot of that law and policy has already been discussed, so you can revisit some of the anti-discrimination laws and things like that we've looked at throughout the unit on this topic. But I do want to point out here the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of People, Rights of Indigenous People, and especially Articles 14, 15, and 16. So Article 14, or even in the preamble actually of that United Nations Declaration, which was signed in 2007 by Australia. Even in the preamble, there's some words about education, and it says that we have an obligation as signatories to that declaration to recognize, in particular, the rights of Indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of child. So we start to get a flavor here in this declaration right away that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia have a right to share responsibility for education with non-Indigenous people. It goes further in Article 14 to talk about their right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions to provide education in their own languages and in a manner appropriate to the cultural methods of teaching and learning. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people under this convention also have the right to levels and forms of accessing all levels and forms of education without discrimination. And also that the government's going to work in conjunction with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to take effective measures for Indigenous, in this case Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and particularly the children and those living outside of their communities, to have access to an education in their own culture and in their own language where possible. Article 15 goes on to say that they have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which should be appropriately reflected in education and public information. So I'll stop reading from that very interesting declaration now, but I'll just note that Articles 17 and 21 also have specific implications for education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Indigenous peoples around the world too, First Nations people. We also have the AITSL standards, which, as I pointed out before, there are particular obligations of teachers at the minimum graduate level towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other culturally and linguistically diverse people in terms of teaching students here in Australia. So I've got the graduate standards on the screen now, and you can see that standard 1.4 particularly requires us to understand strategies for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in particular. And we also have that same responsibility for other culturally and linguistically diverse students too. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we also have a responsibility in Standard 2.4 to make sure that we are able to teach in a way that promotes reconciliation by having demonstrating our broad knowledge and understanding and respect for histories, cultures, and languages. And these standards evolve as you move through your teaching career here in Australia. So those are at the graduate level, the minimum expectation for you to be working in the profession, which after 2 years minimum working full-time, you've then got to upgrade to full proficiency, which has increased demands as well. So we do have quite a commitment here. And there are other standards that indirectly relate to our responsibilities for teaching CALD students as well. So when we're looking at the teaching of CALD students, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, there's this concept of the curriculum clash, which was put forward by Anderson in 2022, but building on a lot of other literature about this notion that we have a fundamental problem when we have a unidimensional curriculum like our Australian curriculum, and any curriculum that aims to serve a multitude of cultures. So here in Australia, we have a curriculum that's supposed to serve everyone, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but there is an inherent clash of cultures here in the intended curriculum that we're supposed to provide. And this means that there's a lack of specific curriculum related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. This is an ongoing problem that we're still trying to address in our curriculum. So this includes students we need a curriculum, that includes students, and not having one with enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural content is one factor that's been identified as leading to higher dropout rates and absenteeism and disengagement from school that increases as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students get older in school. So despite these difficulties with Western schooling that can be had by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, Harris discusses in his book in 1990 about two-way schooling. He talks about how the vast majority of Aboriginal parents still want their students to learn the 3 hours or reading, writing, and arithmetic, and I'll talk about why in a moment. The National Aboriginal Council recommends policy for building on our cultural heritage to foster strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait identity in our students, and that we need to have essential Aboriginal studies for all students about culture, history, and lifestyles of those students. They also say that we need educational services that build cultural pride as well as academic and technological skills. And that Aboriginal people need to play a key role in the delivery of educational students. So when we work towards trying to get some integration in how we deliver curriculums, those are some things that we can look at. But there's a really interesting theory that I'd like to talk a little bit about from Harris, who talks about how when we're discussing the education of Aboriginal peoples, and particularly Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we and perhaps other CALD students too, and you can think about the extent to which you feel like this stretches to them too, but his theory of two-way schooling is extremely relevant here. And now I had a picture of him, like I know all the other theorists I've presented, I've had a black and white picture of the person. And I just want to note that I did have a picture of him here, but as he has passed away, I just wanted to be culturally sensitive and not put that picture there, because for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that can be quite sensitive. So I've just put a picture of his book cover there instead. Anyhow, he lived from 1942 to 2020, and he was a researcher and Aboriginal scholar at several Australian institutions here, but he's primarily an educator and anthropologist working in the Northern Territory here with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So you can read his book. It's actually quite an easy read, and you can access it through our library, and it's called Two-Way Aboriginal Schooling, Education, Culture and Survival. In this, he's drawing on two separate knowledges and two distinct cultures and discussing how we go about creating a schooling that retains both cultures in a respectful way. And this is sometimes called bicultural schooling. So there is other theory around this that you can perhaps look at. But his scholarly work, as I said, was focused on those remote communities here in Australia, especially in the Northern Territory, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples live in communities. And he found that these students who were living in these communities, their experiences, engagement with Western culture ranged. And he describes this engagement with culture as with Western culture as more destructive, less destructive, or culture retained. And that's his categorization there. And of course, the goal here is to retain culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So he is, in his theory, trying to find a solution for a schooling where students can learn about a second culture or a Western culture without destroying or demeaning their first culture for where they come from. And he calls this two-way schooling. So he notes in his book also that there are lots of other cultures in the world that have retained strong cultural identity, including First Nations cultures, where they've retained their norms and traditions and their cultural identity in the face of cultural attacks and adversity that can be imposed by the dominant culture and has been historically aggressively opposed. So, for example, he looks at the Hasidic Jews and what they do with their schooling in terms of having completely separate schools and separate educations, and the Amish and the Hutterites as well, and how they retain control of their education as much as possible. And then he also looked at the Pueblo and First Nations tribe in New Mexico and how they retained control over a lot of aspects of their culture around and kept those aspects of their culture quite secret from the Western culture or the invaders at the time, and how that worked with education as well. So really interesting read from him, and I encourage you to explore his theory further. He talks about two-way schooling in terms of a long history of Aboriginal knowledge as well, and that he actually sought out and formalized with what he wrote in his book. So his theory quotes elders from the communities that he was living and working with in the Northern Territory of Australia too. And he based his thinking primarily around this two-way schooling on previous thought from Aboriginal leaders. And he quotes Pincher Nirmari in his vision of Aboriginal two-way schooling for his particular group of Gurindji students in the Northern Territory. So with that, he was drawing on those ideas from that elder and other elders that he learned from them, proposing this theoretical solution to schooling where two cultures could exist simultaneously, so that Aboriginal children could learn both ways in this two ways models, and it's sometimes called both ways education as well in different literature. So what he was arguing was that Aboriginal students should be supported, and Torres Strait Islander students should be supported to learn the dominant culture as a second culture in school, but not to do that by this unconscious osmosis, which would happen through like the hidden curriculum. but rather being very conscious of the differences in the culture, so that promoting a biculturalism where they can learn to what he quotes as, they can put the culture on like a set of clothes if they need to. So they can put on that Western culture, but then they can take it off again. But they're also still entitled to learn and grow their positive Aboriginal cultural identity while at school too. So schools need to do both of those things, the two-way schooling system, which fairly represents both cultures in that context. And he offers examples of successful schools from communities where this has been enacted, and he conceptualized that these both-way schools, or two-way schooling, is a place where there's equal power, reciprocity, recognition between the two cultures, and a spirit of exchange of knowledge both ways. And in this way, the school could foster or serve to foster healthy relationships between older and younger people. So this is titled as Domain Separation of the Two Cultures, so Western culture and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, so that the two can be simultaneously existing in schools. Okay, so there are lots of dilemmas to confront, and he opens the doors to start talking about this in his book, and there's a lot of other literature that follows. So there's lots of dilemmas here in terms of what the issues that a two-way school would face, or two-way schooling would face. So how do we prioritize literacy, language, and numeracy of the dominant Australian culture, the white culture, the colonizer culture, without demeaning or degrading Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures here? And he draws on community-based examples of mixed successes in meeting this aim. Other dilemmas that he confronts include, how do we meet those community aspirations for schooling while also meeting government responsibilities for schooling? And how do we retain those cultural identities of our students while also equipping them with the knowledge and skills that they need for an autonomous future? And with that, he discusses, how do we develop this education that can give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people power in the dominant culture that they live in here in Australia, as a greater Australia. And, parents want that power for their children so that they can be sort of economically successful, I guess, in the world that they're living in, and to lead different aspects of Aboriginal communities too. So if they're to have a future themselves in their communities and where they're autonomous, they're arguably in this globalized world that we live in, where there's all this communication, they're going to require that reading, writing, and numeracy skills to communicate and govern themselves in this context that we're living in today, where we're not very isolated from one another. So another conflict here is, how do we learn in a schooling system that is inherent conflict? We have inherent conflict here with ways of understanding and knowing. So there's epistemological conflict, if you like, and there's a reading from, I think it was week 4, about that conflict, different worldviews and different understandings of how we come to know about our world. So, for example, Western people, we view knowledge as personal property, something that should be objectively available to anyone, and this is in direct contradiction with what Harris argues. It's an irreconcilable contradiction between the two cultures, and there's not room for compromise here. So how do we do both? How do we understand both ways of knowing? The social damage, that last point of the hidden curriculum I mentioned already, but this idea that, we have a hidden curriculum where we're rubbing off implicit social norms and values without being conscious of that. So one example that he gives in the book is about classroom organization and how, seating arrangements may ignore Aboriginal age and sex roles in communities without acknowledging those traditional values around those roles. So how do we reconcile that? Teachers' use of words and names around deceased members of the community, for example, which may not be culturally acceptable in a specific community. Or how we talk about how students have missed school even when they come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Islander backgrounds. So, for example, if an Aboriginal student has missed a lot of time for a funeral, and the way that teachers talk about that may be sort of through the hidden curriculum, implying that they should be at school more, because they learn more at school than they do in those cultural traditions and obligations that they have. So we've got to be really conscious of all that. And I know I've talked about the hidden curriculum already. The two-way schooling model also has a lot to say about the preservation of vulnerable languages and cultures. So, but it continues to be used here in Australia, and in WA there is a great manual that you can read, the full training guide online, that is used to educate schools and teachers here. And I really encourage you to pursue that guide to two-way learning in WA as well. It's through this professional development that you can access online, and it provides a full guide on how to work with Aboriginal leaders as partners in delivering this curriculum, but it does make a really good reading. All right, and then in terms of also moving away from Harris's theory now, but intricately related, it's also this idea that curriculum isn't the only element of education, and it sits with other parts of education that can nourish people's cultural identities, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' identities in terms of their culture. And this always comes back to relationships with our students, with our teachers, with our school, between family, with community. And to be culturally, to recognize cultures and support them, ultimately working towards nourishing them. We also have to be flexible. We have to be localized in the community that we're working in and with. We have to ensure involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in delivery, in the management of those education programs. We have to build that safe community for people from different cultural backgrounds within our school and institution. Recognizing and teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, and promoting cultural reference and expression in our schools. And that work comes from Anderson too. So we can talk about how to provide that curriculum, but also how to do that in a way that overall in our education system nourishes those cultures and those cultural identities by becoming culturally responsive, reflective, and relevant in our approach to how we deliver curriculum and how we teach and interact with our students in the class. As always, this is the foundation for what we do as educators, and having those high expectations for them means that we need to confront our stereotypes, as we talked about in week 7, so that we can help them build their cultural identity. So in conclusion, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students here in Australia have educational needs that we have an obligation to address as educators, and they are culturally and linguistically diverse learners. We have other culturally and linguistically diverse learners here in Australia as well, and in the Perth context as well, where we're learning here at ECU. And we can make comparisons between some of that theory that I've talked about for how to promote the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners too. And again, someone's language and culture, their way of speaking and their culture is intricately connected. So with that, I'll encourage you to perhaps take a short break, but come back and watch the second part of the lecture this week. That second part focuses on linguistic diversity. There's some references for you. Thanks so much.